Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You could also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. What would change my mind? At its surface, this question seems entirely fair. In fact, an inability to answer this question on any given topic may well serve as evidence for an unreasonable and/or irrational mindset. Imagine, for example, if a believer in the flat earth were unable or unwilling to hypothesize about the kind of evidence that would change their mind. Surely, the flat earther could conceptualize a scenario where NASA invites them aboard a space shuttle with the intention of showing them the spherical earth from space itself. Whether or not this is likely to happen is beside the point. What matters is that it's possible, in practice, to answer the question, what would change your mind? Bombastic though this answer might be, and while such elaborate methods are certainly not required to prove the spherical earth, it's still an answer. In other words, the flat earth is principally falsifiable. That is, it's possible to marshal evidence against the proposition. The same can be said about any empirical proposition. So surely it's possible for atheists to answer this question as well. Surely an atheist could hypothesize about the kind of evidence that would change their mind. Yet, many of the world's most popular and accomplished atheists appear incapable of answering this very question.
Do you feel like you could be persuaded by a really great argument, or would it take some kind of experience that just was somehow undeniable in your personal psychology or whatever to kind of shift you towards theism?
So that's a really difficult question, right? I mean, at this point, people often, think about Hume talking about in the dialogues about the voice in the sky. So people ask, what would it take? And the answer is, I have no idea, right? I mean, I don't see that something like that, a voice that speaks to everybody in their language, right? That's just not in the cards for, our world, right?
Yeah.
So, and even on most Christian stories, that's not on the cards, right? I'd say.
But when it comes to, I don't believe that a God exists, what would change my mind? That's a difficult question, because when you say evidence and argument, the natural follow-up question is, okay, you need to be more specific. What evidence would convince you? And the reason this is natural and intuitive is because this is the question we would ask for anything else. If I were to hold up this box of playing cards and say, do you believe that it has a complete deck of 52 cards in it? And in this case, you could say, well, we could open the box and count and make sure that there were in fact 52 cards in there, and that would confirm. Unfortunately, the God proposition and a number of other things that supposedly are part of a supernatural realm can't be addressed like this. And so a few years ago, after dealing with the problems of these answers, I came up with what I think is a better answer, what I think may be the best answer, not because I thought of it, but because I think it covers all the ground. And that is this. I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God. But if there is such a being as a God, then one would think that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened, which means that either this God does not exist, or this God doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, it's not my problem.
Some people might accuse you of being so committed to atheism that you'd never be willing to countenance any evidence that might lend support to a creator behind the universe. So I'm just interested, what sort of evidence could science or the physical universe present to you that would make you think, actually, that is evidence that there's a mind behind this?
I find that a very difficult question. If I were looking in the Bible for evidence, heaven forbid, I would expect to see maybe increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. And that is
if there was literally an equation in the Bible,
equation
like
in
that.
the Bible, rather than all this wishy-washy, elastic writing that it pervades.
All right. So if there was something like that they discovered in the Bible,
then I'd think it was probably a forgery.
Well, exactly. The problem is, would it actually make you?
No.
I mean, is there anything from, is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make, I mean, if the stars lined up to spell, Peter, please believe in me, it's about time.
I put it down to madness.
You put it down,
to personal madness.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that will persuade you away from atheism.
Well, to be honest, I think that's probably the case.
In that sense, do you even have an evidence-based view if you're actually committed to atheism a priori?
Well, I'm predicting that there will be no such evidence. That's not quite the same thing as being committed to it a priori. I can't.
But you've said there's no evidence that would persuade you otherwise.
I think it's much more likely that I would have gone mad than such evidence would have been provided.
Right. So in principle, it's impossible to ever persuade you that God exists.
I didn't quite say that, but.
Well, what would persuade you?
I can't conceive of. I suppose, even if I died and was confronted with, St. Peter saying, "Welcome to heaven," I'd probably think I was dreaming.
Does this prove what theists have always suspected? Are atheists merely stubborn? Are they being unreasonable and or irrational? Are they the fools who had said in their hearts, there is no God? I don't think so. And here's why. When it comes to the God hypothesis, the question, what would change your mind, is actually a surprisingly difficult one to answer. Why? This is due to the nature of the claim. We're talking about something which not only has never been demonstrated, but something that, by definition, exists in a unique category of its own. God, according to those that believe in him, is a supernatural entity. This means that God is composed of a substance or substances that exist beyond the periodic table of elements. God is non-physical or spaceless. God is eternal or timeless. God is non-physical or immaterial. And in addition to these descriptors, God is alleged to be all-knowing and all-powerful, or at the very least, maximally knowing and maximally powerful. While some may be tempted to glean over these descriptors, the fact is that they couldn't be more important when it comes to evaluating the supposed inability of leading atheists to answer the question, what would change your mind? So let's examine these characteristics and why they make the God hypothesis uniquely difficult to falsify. I began this discussion by explaining how preposterous it would be for a believer in a proposition to be unable or unwilling to hypothesize about the kind of evidence that would change their mind. And for the most part, this is true. But when it comes to God, the allegedly non-physical immaterial entity that exists outside of space and time, how can one hypothesize about the evidence that would make them a believer? Please notice that this claim is unlike any other. The flat earther can easily conceptualize being shown a spherical Earth from the comfort of an orbiting space shuttle. Nothing about that conceptualization is impossible. The flat earther will deny the reality of the conceptualization, sure, but they can still imagine such evidence in their mind's eye. In other words, they can conceptualize being shown the very thing that they do not believe in. But how can the atheist conceptualize being shown a God? To put it another way, how can the atheist conceptualize something non-physical that exists outside of space and time? An honest attempt to conceptualize such an agent reveals an inability to do so. Whatever I imagine will, of necessity, be composed of parts. Parts which an immaterial entity presumably wouldn't have. Whatever I imagine would also, of necessity, exist in some space, be it a white or black backdrop in the mind's eye, or some other backdrop of my imagining. Again, this would be inappropriate, given the description of this entity's alleged spacelessness. I could go on, but suffice to say, it's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to conceptualize a God. And I'm not alone in this conclusion. Apophatic theology denies the possibility of describing God, claiming instead that the best one can do is say what God isn't. God isn't physical, that is, he's non-physical. God is not bound by time, that is, God is eternal, etc. The apophatic tradition, in other words, acknowledges the problem that atheists face when asked, what would change your mind? Essentially, atheists are being asked to affirm and describe God and or the trace evidence that such an entity would leave behind. All the while, the very description of this entity defies any expectation of discovering such evidence or even conceptualizing what this evidence would look like. So coming back to the question, what would change your mind? Given the unique nature of the God claim, isn't it unfair to expect atheists to answer this question? There's no verifiable evidence or observational data of an immaterial entity. In fact, it sounds paradoxical to expect evidence for something immaterial and or non-physical. No theist and or religious person has ever identified or explained a mechanism for detecting the supernatural. So, pointing out that I don't know what would convince me of the existence of such an outlandish and hitherto unobserved entity is not an attempt to avoid a challenge. It's merely an acknowledgement of the limits of my knowledge and epistemology more generally. If you've come up with some mechanism for detecting the immaterial, let me know, but until then, we're stuck. With all that said, there will undoubtedly be some in the audience who have the following thought. But Magic Skeptic, if indeed it's impossible to investigate the God claim, and if it's impossible to provide evidence given God's alleged immateriality and spacelessness, aren't you unreasonable to expect evidence from theists? Aren't you guilty of the same unreasonable expectation when you ask theists for evidence? Isn't what evidence would change your mind principally the same as asking, what evidence do you have for your belief in God? And don't both questions place on the individual an expectation to supply evidence for an unfalsifiable proposition? This is a great question, and the answer is yes. Asking theists to provide evidence for their belief in God does place the burden of proof on them. But such is life. It's not the atheist's fault that theists have erected a unique claim that appears to be impervious to investigation. If your claim is unfalsifiable, that's on you. All I'm arguing in this video essay is that it's not the responsibility of your interlocutors to disprove your unfalsifiable claim. It's not on atheists to explain what would change their minds when your claim is constructed in such a fashion as to make conceptualizing it, or any supporting evidence for that matter, an impossibility. If your belief is constructed in such a manner that evidence cannot be marshaled either for or against it, then you are unreasonable for accepting it, because unfalsifiable beliefs, by definition, have no evidence that counts in their favor. Now, some will be quick to point out that unfalsifiability also makes rejection of the claim unreasonable, because, by definition, no evidence can count against the claim either. But to this I say, non-belief is the default position. There are countless unfalsifiable propositions that one wouldn't dare remain agnostic on. You can't prove you're not dreaming right now. You can't prove you're not in the Matrix. And you can't prove that you weren't spawned into existence seconds ago with all of your memories intact, etc. Yet, despite your inability to disprove any of these propositions, I trust that you're not agnostic in relation to any of them. Rather, you reject these propositions despite their unfalsifiability, because those that believe them have failed to meet their burden of proof. And you wouldn't listen to their protestations about how unreasonable you are for expecting evidence for their claims. The fact that these claims exist in a special category is not your problem. But ask yourself, what would change your mind? What would it take to convince you that you're dreaming? Some might be quick to say, waking up. Waking up would convince me that I was dreaming. But couldn't waking up be part of the dream? Suddenly, it becomes very difficult to specify what would change your mind. In short, it's difficult, if not impossible, to conceptualize the kind of evidence that would convince you that you're actually dreaming. So, are you dreaming right now? If you think you're awake, what would change your mind? Moreover, are you stubborn, irrational, or unreasonable for failing to conceptualize the kind of evidence that would prove to you that you're actually asleep? Clearly, one's inability to describe such evidence does not indicate an ideological commitment to the belief, I am awake. It's merely the case that the contrary claim, that is, you're dreaming right now, is unfalsifiable and has not met its burden of proof. Therefore, in my view, one is justified in rejecting the claim. The truth is, and like the dream example, the God claim is not normal. It's constructed such that it's impervious to investigation. How can I explain what would convince me of the existence of something that has so much in common with nothingness? The claim is non-tangible, uninvestigable, and beyond our senses. So how can I answer the question, what would convince me? Theists have created an unfalsifiable hypothesis which, by definition, cannot be proven either way. So when they ask atheists, what would convince you? They are asking for an impossibility. They're asking atheists to elucidate on their evidential requirements for a poorly defined hypothesis that appears to be unfalsifiable to begin with. The atheist's inability to answer the question is not evidence of stubbornness or intellectual balkanization. It is evidence of how poorly the hypothesis is defined and how unfalsifiable questions cannot be answered. Yet theists will smugly assume and assert that atheists are merely stuck in their ways.
Sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that will persuade you.
Meanwhile, theists seem to interpret everything as confirmation of this being. The physical world, the laws of physics, the Big Bang, evolution, charity, goodwill, beauty, morality, etc. It's all evidence for God. But the list doesn't stop there. Cancer, tsunamis, hurricanes, parasites, flesh-eating viruses, all of this serves as evidence for God as well. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It all supports their unfalsifiable presupposition that God exists. It's almost as if those who believe in God will not allow anything to count as evidence against their belief. And I'm not the first one to notice. Once upon a time, two explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds. One explorer says, some gardener must tend this plot. The other disagrees. There is no gardener. So they pitch their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen, but perhaps he is an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence. They electrify it. They patrol with bloodhounds, for they remember how H.G. Wells' Invisible Man could be both smelt and touched, though he could not be seen. But no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received the shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry. Yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks, a gardener who has no scent and makes no sound, a gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. At last, the skeptic despairs, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? This parable of the gardener, a story told originally by John Wisdom and developed by Anthony Flew, typifies the reasoning that's often coupled with unfalsifiable propositions. The reality is, once one adopts the unfalsifiable belief that God exists and that he created everything, then of course everything becomes evidence for God, the good and the bad. And no frequency of divine hiddenness can deter the believer, as there's always and inevitably another qualifier that can be added to preserve the belief: invisible, intangible, outside of space-time, etc. Meanwhile, atheists like those featured at the beginning of this video essay honestly acknowledge their inability to elucidate on what exactly would change their minds because the proposition is unfalsifiable. So, in closing, I ask myself, what would change my mind? And I must take refuge in the company of my fellow atheists by saying, I don't know.
And the answer is I have no idea, right?
I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God.
I find that a very difficult question.
Yet, such an admission does not constitute evidence of my stubborn commitment to atheism, no more than my inability to explain the kind of evidence that would prove I'm dreaming is evidence of my stubborn commitment to the belief that I'm awake. The truth is, I am awake, and there is no God. And I feel mighty comfortable holding those beliefs by default until my interlocutors come up with some evidence to the contrary.